A new CBS News poll finds that the majority of Americans are worried about the country's response to the coronavirus. 62% of people in the U.S. now say that efforts against the outbreak are going badly, compared to 57% earlier this month. The president's public opinion rating has also taken a beating. For more on all of this, let's go ahead and bring in CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, you've been tracking views on the virus since the outbreak first started. What's behind this latest step?
Hey, it's good to see you. And let me add one thing to that number you mentioned in the majority of people who say that it's not going well. That's actually a record in our polling. It's been people increasingly thinking that that effort isn't succeeding. And one thing you look at here is the rise in concern across the South, where, of course, many of the states are seeing their cases spike. We find that in that region, there's a lot of concern growing. And, you know, part of this and these measures, Lana, has always been whether people personally feel like they're at risk for getting it. Well, the number of folks who say that they are very concerned has also ticked up. That's one reason behind all of this. And then you look at the policy side, there's people who say that they feel that their state opened up too quickly rather than too slowly, and that's all part of that overall number where people are increasingly concerned about how the efforts to fight this are going on.
Well, Anthony, let's also talk about masks, which has been increasingly in the conversation again recently. Those have become very political. Take us through that, and how does it work in the latest polling?
Indeed, they have become politicized, and we see that in these numbers. First of all, you just look at the simple party splits. When we ask people, are you wearing one, and how often? And you see that Democrats, and to some extent independents, report that they're wearing them more often than Republicans are. But you always want to go one step further and ask people, well, what's behind that decision-making process? So we said, okay, is it for you mainly a personal choice, or do you see it more as a public health responsibility? And you see a big partisan split in that too, where a majority of Republicans say it is a personal choice, that decision whether or not to wear a mask, but a majority of Democrats, an overwhelming majority, and also most independents, then say they see it as a public health responsibility. So that's part of the politicization, it's easy for me to say, of all of that. But it's also, when you look at people who just say they see the fight against coronavirus now in political terms, you find that half of people say that across all parties, and in particular, Republicans say that they see all this in political terms, and that's part of the reasons behind all this now.
That's so interesting, Anthony, given how much Vice President Pence and the coronavirus task force from the White House has been re-emphasizing the importance of wearing masks, how that is potentially undercut by some of the things that we've seen on the campaign side. So there's another really big thing that we, of course, need to discuss, the recent protests. Looking at how Americans are reacting, our poll found that most people say that they agree with Black Lives Matter and that they disapprove of President Trump's handling of these protests against systemic racism. What else are they saying, and how much is this, again, a Republican versus Democrat issue versus independents, people without necessarily political affiliations weighing in?
Well, there are partisan splits on that, to be sure, and it's Democrats who are more likely to say that they agree with the ideas expressed as they see them by Black Lives Matter. Republicans very much disagree with that perspective. However, you look at that 60-40% split overall in the public saying that they agree with those ideas. We want to look at this in context, and we have seen in recent polling this shift among Americans in agreement with the protests and in context against other movements over the course of the last few decades even of CBS News polling. You're seeing a real shift here that doesn't happen very often and doesn't often happen this quickly. We also see, when we ask people, do they agree with the protesters themselves, you also see people, a majority, saying that they do, or at least by a larger ratio than oppose them, I should say. saying that they do agree with those protesters. That, again, is a fairly significant change in a short period of time. So the takeaway from this is that these protests and the movement does seem to be having a real effect in moving public opinion.
Yeah, and Anthony, with the majority of Americans agreeing with Black Lives Matter and the recent protests and disapproving of President Trump's handling of both those protests and the coronavirus, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the implications for the November election, though I can kind of guess what you might say.
Well, look, if you look across the board at polls that are being done nationally, of course, it's not a national race, but it gives you a larger sense of where things are. You do see Joe Biden ahead. That includes our polling, but you also see Joe Biden ahead in many states. I want to emphasize this, and I think folks will probably, get tired of hearing me emphasize this, but I'm going to keep doing it. When we get to November, it really is going to depend on how easy and accessible it is for people to vote and who actually does. And I think that's always been true, but it's going to be particularly true this year. We have seen throughout these primaries folks having to stand in line for a long time. Obviously, a lot of people switching over to mail ballots if they can. That change in the process could have a really dynamic effect on turnout. And so when we look at the polls, think of them as an expression of preference. But when we get to November, it is going to really be a matter of how easy, how accessible, and how many people are actually going to go out and able to go out and cast that ballot. And that really ties back to where this outbreak might stand when we get there, Alana.
Anthony, always great to talk to you.
Thanks, you too.